Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns. This is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. As you know, we're about a paragraph into Theorem 15. So let me share my screen with you here and we will get started looking at that. What Dee is going to have for you is another Kabbalistic exercise now that we are deep into understanding that Kabbalah is one of the very primary frameworks he is using in his project here of taking apart that monad glyph, this one here, and putting it back together. I'm assuming, of course, that you know who John Dee is, you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is, and beyond that, you have understood it through the first 14 theorems. Dee has taken this glyph apart. He has used it to create the universe symbolically. The universe has fallen. We're after the fall now, and he's resurrecting it again with symbolic references to the shape he has provided here for you. Resurrecting that world in his terms is an act of revelation as much as an act of sacred geometry, or perhaps you could say they're the same thing. Anyway, he's going to be symbolically rebuilding it for the entire rest of this class using his monad glyph. So we left off last time with a very famous alchemical quote, "Nature rejoices in nature." Theorem 18 was very long, so we just went through this first paragraph here where you see my cursor moving up and down. We notice that he's talking about various things being exalted. We're going to come back to that. He's introduced the sign of Taurus as also being associated with his glyph. There's a diagram here that wouldn't fit in with all the text, so I'm going to get to it very shortly. And we ended, as I mentioned, with nature rejoices in nature, where he says, at the end of that paragraph, they have said Taurus is in the house of Venus, indisputably the house of virtuous and prolific conjugal love. And we have seen all of his puns on Venus. In Latin has Veneris, everything from Mons Veneris, the pubic area of a woman, to something very venerable, honorable, and so forth. And of course, the planet associated with grace and beauty. Then he goes into this quote, "Has the great Ostanes concealed in his most secret and recondite mysteries, nature rejoices in nature." There it is in ancient Greek. And what I mentioned to you is, first of all, nature doesn't have our current meaning. It can mean anything from origin or originating power, like the powers of God that emanate in the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life, like the shapes that Timaeus describes in his Pythagorean cosmogenesis. It's the essence of a thing. So an expanded version of the saying would be, nature rejoices in nature, nature rules over nature, nature is the triumph of nature. Sometimes then you get a whole nother section of nature begets nature, but only a lion can give birth to a lion, and so on. So the idea that it's only, something can only be birthed by something else that shares its same essence. And since he's shifting all of this over into symbolic spiritual alchemy using the middle pillar of a tree, the idea is that you are working your way back up that tree, anointing yourself with divine light, which is the substance of what you are in those terms. I have a picture of this book over to the side here because while Dee refers to Ostanes and Democritus, who is the Greek student of Ostanes, there is no surviving text by either of them. There is not really even a record of Ostanes in Farsi, which would have been his native language in Persia or contemporary Iran. So what Martelli did was to go back and look at books by Democritus, pseudo-Democritus, meaning people writing in his style or saying that this is a teaching of his, something like that, and putting together the existing works we have today, because we can translate these works into English now from Latin, from Arabic, because it comes into Latin through Arabic, but we don't have Greek originals. Anyway, the idea is that this nature rejoices nature, often quoted, is in the story of how Democritus was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries of Memphis by Ostanes. A similar speech is in the Turba Philosophorum. I suggested last time, maybe you look at an English translation of it, and there's a wonderful one on Adam McLean's Alchemy website. I gave you the link for that. And I mentioned that later we'll have a video on a particularly expanded version of this that is the Isis, the prophetess to her son Horus letter. It's not in all of the copies of the Pseudo-Democritus texts, but it becomes the one of greatest interest to a Gnostic alchemist. Remember, the Gnostic ascent of the one is a kind of a parallel act of what Dee is doing here in his Hieroglyphic Monad. So Zosimus of Panopolis, if you have heard of him, is very associated with esotericism, ceremonial magic, and alchemy. And this particular fragment was later of great interest to Marie von Franz, who is a student of Carl Jung's. It was also, I've been told, though I'm not sure about this, was of interest to Aleister Crowley. I know it was of great interest to the person who taught myself and Alan Moore, Vincent Bridges, and he wrote about this in his book with J. Widener, Mystery of the Cathedrals. So the explicitly sexual nature of this fragment appears later on in the Enochian work to be of great interest to Dee, because Dee had this expanded version, sometimes called the Codex Marcianus, had a lot of other texts in it too. Anyway, back to Theorem 15, there's nature rejoices in nature, and we're going to continue on from here to the end. Here is the missing diagram. So let me read from the second paragraph on, and then we'll talk about it. Dee says, we also suggest philosophers note how truly, and for what reasons, the sun, after having allowed some eclipsing of his light, accepts this stronghold of Mars. And also in this same house, our Aries, obviously, it is said to be similarly triumphant in its exaltation. What most secret mystery our Monas very clearly and perfectly demonstrates by means of Taurus, here depicted as a hieroglyphic figure, and Mars, which we presented in Theorems 12 and 13, which the sun, stretching out to Aries in a straight line, reveals. So from the present theorem, another Kabbalistic anatomy of our monad offers itself, which is a true and artful explanation. And you get this drawing with the kind of head of the monad now labeled Taurus, the exaltation of the moon. There's the cross of the elements in the middle, and Aries, of course, the fire of the bottom, labeled the exaltation of the sun. And the whole graphic is labeled the exaltations of the moon and the sun, divided in the middle by the knowledge of the elements. Now, we will assume something divided in the middle from all of the illusions before is probably the middle pillar of the tree of life, especially since he says Kabbalistic anatomy of our monad. What he is going to do here with exalt is there's the same sort of linguistic echo chamber in Latin that he's had with numbers here, where you get ternaries and quaternaries over and over again, 12, sevens, over and over again. You get wordplay all the way through here between rejoice, exalt, triumph. So that might explain, if you look at this and you know the meaning of the word exalt, and you're like, well, what? Exalt means to rise above, doesn't it? To rise above in triumph, mainly. But this is at the bottom. So how can something at the bottom be the exaltation of something when it should be at the top? And if you thought that, that's a great question. So let's take apart this word in English, and the English word comes directly from Latin. So then that'll allow an easy transition into the word plays he's making here. First of all, exalted is an adjective. It means elevated in rank, character, or status, something that is lofty or noble. When something becomes exalted, it becomes more noble. As a verb, exalt is transitive. That means it has to have a direct object, like the public exalted the queen. You can't just say the public exalted. It has to have a direct object. So it means to honor something, or to elevate or hold something in high esteem. It can be to make something noble, to refine something, to elevate. Little typo there with elate, because I'll just pretend that's intentional and is hooking to rejoice, although we're not quite to rejoice yet. If you make exaltation a noun, it's like any time that you add tion to a verb that comes from Latin, you've made it into a noun. Just free grammar lesson there. It's the process of exalting something. So like the exaltation of silver whitens it, you could say. So in Latin, this verb, exalto, puns on another Latin verb, so that if you're listening to it in Latin, you can't miss it. They're so close. And that other verb is exulto, which means to rejoice, to be happy, especially to be happy in triumph. So do you see the echoes I'm talking about there between nature, rejoicing in nature? In fact, that's why Dr. Turner and I picked the word rejoice instead of delight or some other verb. So somebody who is working through the Latin and just wanting a little help will notice this wordplay. So now exulto is an intransitive verb, which means it doesn't have to have a direct object. Like you can just rejoice. You don't rejoice upon something, for example. And it's made from another verb that actually means to jump up, to leap. Like you're so happy, you're jumping up. Like, wow, this is great. Nature rejoices in nature. I am made of that stuff that made me. That's the flavor of what you're getting here in Latin. Implicitly, something that you exalt or raise up also makes you happy, at least it's supposed to, linguistically. Something that is exalted has triumphed over something else that is not exalted. So you see some of the poetry going on there. It's much more beautiful than you can imagine in English translation, no matter how good of a translation you're reading. So nature rejoices in nature implicitly, as Dee uses all of the words around that Greek phrase, all the Latin around it is implying that a lower nature will rejoice and be exalted by a higher nature. So perhaps in terms of the tree, the nature of the physical world, or Malkuth, rejoices that it is receiving the light of the moon, Yesod, or Tiferet, the moon. But let's keep going here. So I want to mention also about some of the houses. We talked about it last time, but I don't think it will hurt to be slightly repetitive since not everyone watching this is an astrologer. Astrologers consider the sun exalted in the house of Aries, which is ruled by Mars, and the moon is exalted in Taurus, which is ruled by Venus. So what that means in terms of astrology is that they're elevated or exalted. They have greater power or influence when they're in those signs. Now, we just say house in English, and that's what you'd say in Latin too, domum. But domum can mean more things in Latin. It can also be a kind of philosophy or way of thinking. Oh, you're thinking in the house of Democritus, for example. Anyhow, let's go back to our frame of the emerald tablet. Well, if the sun and the moon and the emerald tablet are creating the one thing, that one thing is exalted when it realizes it is made of the sun and the moon, and the sun and the moon are exalted, right? So since nature rejoices in nature, the one's process of exaltation, again, it implies that it becomes exalted as it realizes it partakes of the nature of those two great things that made them. And you can do this all the way back through every context we've had. You know, in Genesis, Adam and Eve realize they're made of the God that made them. I understand that's not doctrinaire Christianity, but that's how you would apply it to Genesis. In terms of the Timaeus, you would have simply the very common idea that the world of becoming is made of that world of being that is unchanging and eternal, and that is why you contemplate eternal forms, to return, to bring back the Platonic conception of the good. Okay, but we want to look at it here Kabbalistically, and we know that in Theorems 12 and 13, he's used the typical Christian or Hermetic Sephirotic attribution still used today, and one meaning of his interior anatomy is the interior or middle pillar. He's going to bring that meaning along in line with the other meaning Kabbalistically we've talked about, which is the idea that there is sort of a fractal little tree inside of every Sephiros, so that there's within Malkuth, there's Malkuth of Malkuth, Yesod of Malkuth, Tiferet of Malkuth, and so on. Okay, so now let's remember his symbol of Mars, because he says something rather odd here about Mars too. Well, first, you've got to keep in mind he's talking about his symbol of Mars, which doesn't look like the way we draw now, which would be the circle with a line coming out of the top and an arrow. He's drawing Mars like this. So he says that what most secret mystery our Monas very clearly and perfectly demonstrates by means of Taurus, here depicted as a hieroglyphic figure, it's up here, and Mars, which we presented in Theorems 12 and 13, there it is. It's not pictured in the theorem. He's assuming you remembered it, but I'm just sticking it up there to remind you. And Mars, which we presented in theorems 12 and 13, which the sun stretching out to Aries in a straight line reveals. Well, the sun is stretching out to Aries down, right? So the idea here is that it stretches down to raise Aries up. That's the exaltation of the sun. And also we have already the notion of Aries has a fire that is helping fire you up the middle pillar. So where does that fire come from? The sun as captured on the earth. And you can connect that back to everything he's talked about with magical seals if you want to. But we are going to just go on here and look at the Sephira and what this will tell us about his Kabbalistic anatomy, or the Sephiroth. Okay, so remember what Sephira he attributed each planet to when you did your homework working through theorems 12 and 13, and when we talked about that together. And then you wind up putting Aries at the bottom, because this represents also, in different ways that I've talked about already, his whole glyph of the monad. It represents it one way, but when he's building up the world, and it's flipped, and then it flips back, and you have this here. So Aries is always what is firing you. You can think of it, Aries in this sense, as divine inspiration. The divine inspiration that made time begin, in Aries of Aries, if you will. So you're working your way up the middle pillar. And this circle can represent a variety of things, because in a certain sense, it represents the whole monad to a Pythagorean. Sometimes it represents the Theorem pin, sometimes it's a bit higher up on the tree. And figuring out when it's what will be your homework tonight. So bear with me here. You're going to need to figure out a little of this on your own. But hopefully even by now you're starting to see what he's doing. The Kabbalistic anatomy of our monad is going to be another way that you can use what he's talking about and project it onto the tree of life and his monad glyph at the same time. Oh, we should say something about this thing up here. The sun having allowed some eclipsing of its light. You can work that through with the moon eclipsing the sun if you want, and if you do, that's fine. But I would suggest a more useful interpretation would be to look at, I mean, how does Mars eclipse the sun? It works much better if you move it symbolically over to his attributions of the planets. And so you see Mars up here is associated with the Sephira Geburah. Some of you may know that this pillar is sometimes called the pillar of severity after Geburah, just like this one over here. The right pillar is sometimes called the pillar of mercy after Kesed. So the idea is that the severity employed by Geburah to keep order is necessary to keep everything running, sort of. And that eclipses a little bit of the beauty and joy of the sun. Not much, just enough that it's necessary. That's one way you can look at it. There's another way if you want to go to a more advanced level of working up the tree, because these paths all have different associations, and the Hebrew letter Pei is associated with this cross path. And there are some very Martian elements there also. But so if you know that already, you can apply it that way. If you don't worry about it. Let's continue on here and talk about how you would solve this for yourself, because that will be, again, your homework, and I'll have the solutions to that out in a couple more days. Take a look at this anatomy of the monad, and he is going to have you apply basically Mars and Venus, Aries being associated in what he has just said with Mars, and Taurus with Venus. For now, you can ignore the elements, although if you have studied Hermetic Kabbalah, I'll tell you in the very next slide how they'd apply, but you don't need to worry about them otherwise. He's going to get back to that in Theorem 19. Anyway, you're going to treat this as a middle pillar, as we've been doing, that vertical line of the cross of the elements. Remember a couple theorems ago how he projected Mercury onto the tree of life. So what he's going to do now is project Mars onto the tree of life. And implicitly when he does that, he's also telling us how we can project Venus onto the tree of life. So remember, that's his symbol of Mars. His symbol of Venus is just like the symbol of Venus we use now. And I'll give you some hints about this, but I'd like you to try on your own how to do that. One big hint is We've talked about how this head can be the Zauer Anpin. That is, it can, if this dot is the Sephira Tifereth associated with the sun, then the other 5 that are right around it, Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Kesed, and Geburah would be the rest. Try to make the head of Mars the Zaire Anpin. Some of you are probably familiar with a typical projection like that now, only it's not called Mars on the Tree of Life because they're not using this interesting little glyph of Mars that Dee has come up with. Then do the same thing with Venus, except there will be always this effort of balancing things, balancing it around the middle pillar. So since Venus is, in terms of the usual attributions of Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, Venus is below Mars. Venus is associated with Netzach, which is below Tifereth, and Mars is associated with Geburah, which is above Tifereth. You're going to do the same thing, except we'll make Mars, which is in the usual attribution, slightly below. We'll have it reach slightly above. So look for a way to have it include the 3 supernals. One hieroglyphic account of the great tree, Mercury on the Tree of Life, gives us a hint of how to do that, because when we put Mercury on there, the horns of Mercury reached up to the 3 supernals. They didn't have Kether, but they reached up and touched Hokmah and Bina. So maybe you can use that as a hint to how to project Venus on the Tree of Life, or maybe you're a Hermetic Kabbalist and already know how to do that. So as you look at these different anatomies, remember nature rejoices in nature. In these terms, you're anointing yourself by realizing that all of these things are a part of you. And as you separate them out, which is, again, using a metaphor of physical alchemy, you're understanding what they better are to refine and elevate or exalt yourself, which is an act that should make you rejoice. Okay. Now, just an aside, if for those of you that have studied Hermetic Kabbalah and you know and have studied the 4 worlds and how you associate with the 4 elements using Yod He Vav He, here you get a little sleight of hand, because now we forget about Yod He Shin Vav He and go back to Yod He Vav He. All right, and there are reasons for that you can explore or not. So if you know those associations, those are the one that Dee will make. They won't come into play until Theorem 19, really. But it's the idea that the cross of the elements can, in a certain sense, be the cross of the 4 worlds. Okay, so, and you're thinking about this from down here in Asaya. But by the way, this is a great graphic, and if you know who made it, tell me so I can cite him in this video. All right, all we have left now is this notation at the bottom, which is basically a grammatical sex joke, or maybe Dee's serious about it. You be the judge. Let's look at the notation here. He says, 2 things I propose are especially noteworthy here. 1, that the hieroglyphic symbol of Taurus exactly represents to us the diphthong of the Greeks. A diphthong, by the way, is a glide from one vowel to another. It's what we have in English in soup, the OU. It's not a one sound. It's really a glide from one sound to another. So D basically thinks that an omicron with a circumflex over it, which is how you'd indicate a Greek diphthong, or one of the ways, that it looks like the sign for Taurus. And it kind of does. He says it's always the generative singular. Maybe if you read that and you are into grammar, you think, oh, Burns and Turner must mean genitive. Well, no, he makes up a word in Latin, and so we made it up as a grammatical case in English to make you pay more attention to it. His word in Latin is gignativum. You would expect genitivum, or the genitive case, which is one of the many cases in Latin, right? The genitive case. He plays upon the Latin origins of this word, which come from genitus, which is what we get genitals from. Remember, you're in a very conjugal theorem. That's a perfect passive participle of the verb to beget. Hence, the English rendering that we gave it has generative, because that's the idea he wants in here, that this is the generative singular of the first declension. Second, he says, out of an apt local metathesis. A metathesis to linguists means that you alter the phonemes within a word, but it can mean something different in math where you switch things. Here he's referring to a spatial metathesis, so like a geometric metathesis. And you're not switching them in order as you're reading them, like you do with the letter. What you're doing is switching, is rotating them. So there's the sign of Taurus, right? So he says out of an apt local metathesis, basically you tilt it and you get the letter alpha, or the lowercase letter alpha. Capital alpha looks just like the letter A in English. It's where we get the letter A in English, or well, they both come from a common source. Let me put it that way. And so this is kind of like our lowercase a, kind of. So there are other things he's already done with alpha, and he'll get into the alpha omega again. And remember, in the New Testament, as we get toward the book of Revelation, you have Jesus, who you might call the Christos and associate with Tifereth, or you might just take the teaching, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. The letter alpha appears to us in two ways, either with the circle and half circle solely touching, or with them mutually intersecting. So what he's giving you there is an image that we had very early in the first few theorems, because if a circle and a semicircle intersect, the area is in the shape of a vesica piscis, which is considered a holy figure by the Pythagoreans. So like this intersection implies a vesica piscis. It isn't a perfect vesica piscis because you don't actually have two complete circles where the center of one lies on the circumference of the other, but it's giving you an idea of this. Also, this sort of looks like the Piscean fish associated with Christianity. Anyway, he's playing around with all of these things in this ending here. Now, let me give you your homework. First, get a blank copy of the Tree of Life, like this one. Now, if you happen to get one that have these paths where you see my cursor going, that's fine. Just use it anyway. Actually, if you're using that kind of tree, it's not going to make any difference. And that tree will actually have 32 paths, which we know that Hebrew or rabbinic Kabbalists were using. It's just that early on in this course, I was trying hard to establish that he had these sources, and sometimes you get them, they get it drawn out this way. I think the implication of why you draw it out this way is with the side paths is because, first of all, the lightning flash is going to only use these paths, and the other is when you're working back up, you're supposed to stay on the middle pillar, not go up side paths, although some of you may have done path workings where you've gone up them, and if so, wonderful. I'm just explaining why this drawing is the way it is. So review how to draw Mercury on the Tree of Life using this glyph, and we've had that already, right? We had the horns coming up like this, and the intersect going through dot right there, and you had another the thing going through the Zyran pin and also dot, and then you had the middle pillar. You could imagine it going from Tifereth down, though it's actually, if you're including this as a Zyran pin, it really, you only need it to go down from Yesod to Malkuth, and then you had the symbol of Aries underneath here firing the whole thing back up. So that's what you did with Mercury on the Tree of Life. I've just reviewed it for you. Okay, so just on a blank, draw Mars on the Tree of Life using his glyph for Mars. It should be fairly easy. We can review back over things if you want. Remember, it's going to be the Aries glyph here at the bottom. You're going to have to add the Aries glyph onto your blank. And the head will be the Zyran pen. The surrounding area will be Tifereth. So why, when I'm telling you the answer, do I want you to do it? Because things tend to stick in your head when you physically do something with your hands. And the whole idea of taking apart and putting the monad together is it's referring to these bodies of knowledge as a mnemonic device. So you're doing some things to kind of get this Kabbalistic anatomy into your consciousness. Then do the same thing with Venus. You don't have to worry about Aries down here at the bottom because that's not part of the Venus glyph. So the bottom of that line is going to start from Malkuth, and remember the top of it ought to go higher than Mars just to keep the balance. Okay, so until then, and I'll get the answers to that out in a couple of days. Remember, nature rejoices in nature. You're anointing yourself by realizing, by separating everything out, that they're a part of you. And then you, in effect, are refining yourself and moving up the tree. At least that is the thought that he's expressing here for you. All right, I'll have another one out in a couple of days. And it'll be the answers here. After that, I'm going to take about a 10-day break because I have some traveling and some personal things that I'm going to be doing. And then after that, I'll be back with the theorem that has the LVX symbol that is so associated with modern esotericism, where he will take, yes, the letters L and V and X and do various things with them. What he will do, I'll show you